Okay, I guess we're live now. I'm Caroline Leavitt, and this is my friend and co-author,
Hi.
Leora Skolkin-Smith. And we've been friends for a really long time, and we're both really interested in outsiders in fiction, maybe because we're sort of outsiders ourselves. So I think we should just introduce ourselves. Leora, would you like to go?
Sure. My name's Leora Skolkin-Smith, as Caroline said. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, they can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. I've published two novels. I've just finished a third. A lot of what I cover is mental illness. Depression and suicide is what my book is. I'm afraid to say because my husband is a psychiatrist, and we believe very deeply that these are topics that are truly outsider topics. And I tried to handle it in a fictional way. That's about what I can say. My first book was on the Middle East. My mother is from Israel. I turned it back to Caroline.
Okay, well, my name is Caroline Leavitt. I'm the New York Times bestselling author of 13 novels, including Pictures View, Is This Tomorrow, Cruel, Beautiful World, and With or Without You, which just came out in paperback this week. It's a Good Morning America online pick and a best book from People, LitHub, Pop Sugar, featured in the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the Chicago Tribune, NPR, and more. My new novel, tentatively titled Days of Wonder, will be published by Algonquin Books sometime in 2022. And it's about a quintessential outsider, a young woman who was sent to prison when she was 15 for a crime she may or may not have committed. She does not remember. I'm also the co-founder of A Mighty Blaze, the initiative I started with Jenna Blum to help authors in indie bookstores. Currently, I'm promoting the paperback of my novel, With or Without You, which again is about outsider status. It's about a longtime couple and what happens when one person changes after a coma and the other doesn't, and how we get used to that feeling that we're not ourselves, we don't belong anywhere. So Leora and I have been friends forever. We support each other, both emotionally and through our art. We read each other's pages, and we're both really interested in stigmas attached with being the other. So, why are outsiders looked on with such distrust and even hatred? Sometimes it's fear. I think I can speak for Leora and myself because just by dint of being authors, we're kind of outsiders. And I think a lot of that status comes from misinformation. When I was teaching high school, a lot of the students thought that writers were rich, that we all had beach houses, or that we were on that thin line between crazy and regular, which is a terrible label. Writers do not have all beach houses. Both Leora and I believe that writing can sort of bridge that gap by bringing empathy to people and more understanding. So let me ask you, Leora, why do you write about the outsider?
Well, as I said, my husband is a psychiatrist, and I worked a lot in the mental health field. And what I really saw was a stigma was attached to having a breakdown, to suicide, to any form of mental illness. And it was especially attached to if you had been in a mental hospital. And I felt kind of like my mentor was Grace Paley. Okay, so that will explain a lot. She was a big change the world person. So I came to her as a young freshman at Sarah Lawrence at 19, and I had written about being in a mental hospital. And I said, I can never, ever publish this. Nobody can ever know that this ever happened. And she said, no, just the opposite. Everybody has to know. Everybody has to know that it happened. That's what being a writer is, to tell your truth and to get your truth out there so that it becomes a societal truth. And so for me, that's been my struggle as a writer. It's not knowing how to write, but to follow Grace's adage, which is that writing is really about socialization and has a great deal to do with society. It's not just writing a story that makes everybody very happy or makes everybody very sad or whatever you want to put into it. So my new book is very interesting. It's set in World War II. It is about a ship getting bombed by the Germans. So I'm done with mental illness. But the one coming out soon will be on mental illness.
I think that's great. I mean, I learned early on what a what it was like to be an outsider. And I think it really turned me into a writer in the first place. I grew up this shy, anxious Jewish kid with asthma. When everybody was outside playing, I could not, because if it was too cold, I got asthma. If it was too humid, I got asthma. I also had a double whammy of being the only Jewish kid in a very Christian neighborhood. So when my family moved in, there were all sorts of things going on. Kids would come up to me and put their fingers in my hair because they were looking for my horns. When I was in high school, I had kids call me up who were my friends, telling me that they couldn't be my friends anymore because I was Jewish and I killed Jesus. I had no idea how to answer any of these. In fact, even in second grade, my teacher gave us a pop quiz and it was about Jesus. The first question was, what did Jesus say to Mary at the river? And I, of course, had no idea. And everybody else was like writing. So I just wrote down, well, he said, Mary, do you want some water? So of course I got an F on that test. And I brought it home to my mother, shamed. And my mother, who was such a warrior, she marched up to the principal's office and said, what are you doing? My daughter's Jewish. She doesn't know this thing. And the principal looked at her and said, you people, and whenever you hear you anything, you know you're put in the place of the other. You people are always complaining. So being Jewish and having asthma defined me. And I learned early on that what I could do was escape. Escape into books, escape into stories. When I was in the library, I used to ask the librarians, do you have any books about people like me? Because people, that's where the fear comes in. People want to know that it's not dangerous to be mentally ill. It's not dangerous to be Jewish. It's not dangerous to have asthma. So the librarians couldn't really find me a book specific to my situation, but they came pretty close. And they gave me these 18th and 19th century wonderful novels where characters had pleurisy and tuberculosis and consumption. And I loved the sound of those words. So the next time I was out on the playground, one boy came over to me and started laughing at me, again, being the other, and saying, you asthma head, you Jewish girl with horns. I drew myself up and put my hands on my hips and said, I beg your pardon. I don't have asthma. I have pleurisy and consumption. And I watched his face, and his face just sort of was in shock because he didn't know what those words were. But he left me alone after that. And I began to realize two things. At first, you must stand up for yourself. If people want to make you an outsider, you don't have to take on that role. And the second thing I discovered was that words have power. They can help you make a bridge between people. So while my outsider status was being Jewish in a Christian world and being sickly, Leora, you grappled with being binational and also the whole stigma of mental illness and how people...
There were really two, because in a way, if you think about it, Israel's a really crazy place. That's sort of a joke. I mean, my mother came from a lot of insanity and a lot of war. And so it wasn't unnatural in a way for me to inherit certain ideations of violence and a serious illness. But it was very hard growing up being binational from an Israeli mother, because people had conceptions that Israelis are people that had guns and they come after you and they stole the land. And actually my relatives, my grandmother was born in the old city of Jerusalem. They did not take over anybody's land. So I sort of had a double whammo, And I think that a lot of the psychiatry was about being binational. I was taken to Israel every 3 years by my mother to a place that I didn't understand the language and I didn't understand the politics. These aren't politics like Americans know them. I mean, when we have a war, it's over there. When they have a war, it's in their living room. And you're walking on the street and you don't know whether you're going to be bombed. And you have the sense of violence and the sense of otherness. So you have Jewish, as Caroline is speaking about, but on top of it, you have Israeli. And I have to say, and I'm not saying this to sound, pompous, but I started reading Marcel Proust. And here was this man who started a novel writing about the fact that he sat in wait for his mother's kiss every night without shame. And I thought, if anyone can write that, pages and pages of waiting for my mother's kiss, just saying, I want my mother to kiss me. And these are all my feelings about that yearning. And I want to be a writer because I can write about yearnings which are laughed at, ridiculed, and scorned, and make beautiful language. I'm a real kind of language devotee. If I wasn't a novelist, I would definitely be a poet. And when I read poetry or Proust, I just felt a magic. And then all of a sudden, all that terrible stuff, the war in Israel, the depression is what I suffered from. I was in a car accident with my father. It's a big bloody story. Became beautiful. And there was a sense of beauty and magic about the world. And so it's a strange life, because a large part of me knows that without art that is very deep. Look at Van Gogh. I mean, I just heard on the radio that they're having a Van Gogh exhibit. And it's sold out. And nobody could get it. I mean, the man was really crazy. And the art and the depth within himself that he drew to draw the turbulence of the soul was very, very, very valid. And so I think that's how I came to it, if that explains anything. Caroline, I'll give it back to you.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting what you said. And I want to go back to what you said about shame, because I think when people feel ashamed of who they are, sometimes they push that onto somebody else. Like if you're afraid of being the other, you might bully someone so that they're on a lower stature than you are. And, in terms of writing, I think it really is an act of bravery. I always say that writers are the canaries in the coal mines. We're the ones that go down to the dark, dangerous places that nobody else really wants to go to sometimes. And we show you that it's okay. It's not, we shed light on it. I first wrote about my shame when I was writing my 9th novel, Pictures of You, and this little asthmatic boy's character started coming up, and I thought, oh my God, I don't want to write about asthma. Nobody knew I had asthma. I kept it secret. When I went to use my inhaler, I'd go into the bathroom because I had been bullied so badly, and I was an adult, but shame does terrible things to you. So I began writing and writing and writing, and I kept tearing up the pages of this kid with asthma. And then I was talking to one of my friends, and I believe it was you, Leora, and you said, sometimes when you're looking at what you don't want to write about,
that's what you really want to write about.
Should write about.
That's what you should write about.
Yeah, because that's how you heal yourself and you help others. So I started writing this little kid with asthma, and this amazing thing happened. The more I wrote about him, and like me, he was embarrassed, he was shamed, he was bullied, he never would talk about it. He wheezed. Asthma is a very public disease. And I found that the more I wrote about him, the more I felt compassion for him. And the more I felt compassion for this kid I never wanted to write about, the more I began to feel compassion for myself. And something weird happened. The whole time I was writing that book, I didn't really have any major asthma attacks. It wasn't until I turned the book in that I did. And I think, I think it's really important to talk about this stuff too. I mean, it was bad enough that I had to write it and I felt okay. But then when I was on book tour, I had to talk about it. And I thought, oh my God, I have to claim this. Claiming what makes you feel like an outsider is the next step. Writing about it first, then claiming it. So I would stand up in front of all these people and say, well, I had really bad asthma. This is how I feel about it, and blah, blah, blah. And as I was talking about it, I couldn't look at people's faces because I was really, really scared. But to my surprise, what happened was after I was done speaking, people came up to me and said, oh, I'm so glad you said that. Me too, me too, me too. And I asked a few people, oh, why didn't you ask me a question so everybody could have heard it? And they said, oh, no, I can't. So it's all about conquering shame. So I got braver after that because one brave act always turns into another. And I decided to tackle my feelings about being Jewish in a Christian neighborhood. I wrote a novel set in the 1950s with Ava, a divorced Jewish woman at a time when nobody got divorced and when being Jewish was very much associated with being a Christ killer. Well, I felt for her instantly, but what I loved about her was that she was able to do something I hadn't been brave enough to do when I was a Jewish kid in that Christian neighborhood. She was determined to find community, and a community that made her an outsider, a community that did not want her present. And she did that by, trying to go to parties, trying to invite people. But then a boy vanished and she was accused of it. But how she did find that community was in making pies. By forming her own community and satisfying her own needs, people actually began coming to her. Her community came on to her. My new book, the one that sort of doesn't really have a title yet, but I'm calling it Days of Wonder, is about two 15-year-old kids, one from a prominent family, one who's sort of an outsider. She has a single mom who grew up in a Hasidic community, and the poorer girl is sent to prison for a crime she and the boy may or may not have committed. Her prison sentence is indeed a sentence because even when she's left out, people look at you and they think you're a felon, and there's all kinds of messages attached to that. And they don't want to know you. They just don't want to know you. These are all questions that really interest me. Leora, can you tell us about the outsider in your novel? And can you put your face a little further back from the computer? Oh, that's great. That's great. Okay, so tell us about your latest novel and how the outsider.
Well, I really took the bull by the horns in this latest one, and I made up a story in which this girl had been sexually harassed by a very famous author. And she had a breakdown over it, and she tried to kill herself. And because she tried to drown herself, she was saved. She didn't really want to die. She was put in a mental hospital. So I just sort of went all out in describing the mental hospital, the mental patients, and they became my friends in truth.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
And it was suddenly okay. It was suddenly okay to have had those feelings. Tragedy. I had experienced my own personal tragedy, not that was a made up tragedy, but I experienced a personal family tragedy. My father became brain damaged for 9 years, and I could never talk about it. And it's funny because people walking up to me thought I had leprosy or something just because my father was brain damaged, or just because I had been in something, quote, too heavy for normal, natural conversation. And again, getting back to Proust, I discovered this writer who talked so much about these feelings that no one in the world will talk about at a dinner party. And he made beautiful language out of it. And I think a lot of me is a pull towards that kind of beauty, truth and beauty being together, and I'm free. It's very freeing. I mean, I'm shy. I never talk about my personal tributes, but I'm also very happy for the people who have been in hospitals, who will have a book written about what it is like to be in a hospital. I just see so many ads on TV about mental health. And so it's like Grace Paley training of that if you're going to write a truth, write a beauty, and make it about society, and make it about giving something back. And so I had that feeling.
How do you handle it, Leora, when people make judgments about you or where you've been?
I cry.
How do you keep it from crushing you?
It crushes me. I'll be really honest about the answer to your question. It's crushing. It doesn't crush me anymore. Well, I have a wonderful husband and wonderful friends, but it was crushing. Like, I don't like the word crazy. I mean, I think that word should be a bad word.
Right.
I think people should think that that's a word like think or spastic.
Right.
I think that whole
do you remember, Leora, when we were at some cafe in Brooklyn and a bunch of writers came by and they came and they sat at our table and we were all sitting around, and all of a sudden one person said, oh, I have to renew my Zoloft. And there was a little silence because,
Yeah.
and then everybody else, we went around the table and every single writer there was on, we were on Lexapro and Klonopin and Zoloft and everything else. And it was this tremendous feeling of freedom because not only could you think like, oh, I belong with this group of people, but also you could feel that your outsider status because you were taking medications to regulate your emotions was not so outsider after all, that everybody was doing it.
Knowing other writers and reading and realizing that the books I read that really made a dent in my heart, that really moved me, were about very deep things, suicide and murder and being from other countries. I still carry, just to pick up on the Israel thing, I still carry a lot of the political stigma of what a Palestinian is. My mother was born in Palestine, and she's really technically a Palestinian, not an Israeli. She left before the state was formed. So even though I'm Jewish, I'm actually a Palestinian. And every time I say that, I go to the park to walk my dog, and someone asks, you're American, right? If you're not American, through and through, or you're not from a country that is less heated, you're in some pretty hot trouble. And I think that owning it is really what Caroline was saying. When you write, you own it. And you also see the humanity in other people. You begin to see that other people in all their other ways have been outsiders. Maybe they're not from Israel, maybe they haven't been in a mental institution. But each in their way, they carry an outsider feeling. It's a very common human feeling. Mm-hmm. And it makes me feel more human. It makes me feel more a part of the world to address what is truly human. I don't like books that sugarcoat and that most great works. Anna Karenina committed suicide. I mean, I could give you a list of the great novels that dealt with this issue of suicide or self-annihilation. And unfortunately for us, war is very, in the Middle East is very much a part of our lives. And I think we should talk about it. And
I think that's part of the whole healing, being able to talk about things. I think that, just the word outsider, where people are so desperate to belong, it's kind of, if you think back to high school, I just remember all the in crowd, the cheerleaders and everybody else. And when you look at them later, I always felt like, well, they never really had to go deep because everything they did was accepted. But when you're pushed outside of a group where you want to belong, you find kind of unique choices. And that's sort of what I really love writing about. I mean, if you come out of prison and you're still a felon and you've done this terrible thing, how can you live in society? I had a friend and I loved this woman, and it wasn't until we had been friends for 5 years that she said, I had to tell you something. And she told me she had been in prison. And I said, oh, well, why didn't you tell me this before? And she said, well, because I thought you wouldn't want to be my friend, or that you wouldn't believe me, or you'd be afraid of me, or whatever else. It's the same thing with anybody who had ever been a drug addict or tried to kill themselves or anything else. There's certain mindsets we have about these people, and they're not always true. I'm still friends with that woman. I think she's great. And I'm interested in writing about people who somehow are able to find their own solutions, which are not solutions of the norm. Leora, I wanted to ask you, because we're in kind of a cultural swamp now in America, do you think it's a distinctly American thing to feel that we should all be able to handle our problems ourselves?
Yeah, I hate that. I hate that. I really hate that. Yeah.
By the bootstraps, and a lot of people don't even have boots. So can you talk about that?
Well, I think mental illness is really the next landmark that we have to reach. I mean, I see that through the ads that are coming through. I see that the younger population, the population that's in high school and college, there's a lot of suicide. It's number one on the list, Caroline. And I understand that they go to the hospital, and there you meet ordinary people. In the hospital, you meet ordinary people who just couldn't handle it. and you kind of sit in groups and talk about what it is you can't handle. And you learn that kind of human communication and human intimacy. Then you get out and you can't even say that you were in there. Right. So it's kind of like, you know, getting kind of slapped in the face all the time. It's a real problem. I'm not going to try to minimize it. We're facing a real pandemic. They say that after this pandemic, the next one is going to be depression, because people have been in their apartments for a year and a half, and it's already front page news that depression really is something that's very real, that a lot of us have had to handle, and they're still handling. And I would do anything to make someone feel less alone. Because I think less alone. And also, I found resources and imagination. I found literature. I found art. I found Van Gogh. I found beauty. That's what I'm saying. It's kind of truth and beauty is all wrapped up in this. But you can't find anything if you're blocked and denying. You can't. If you live in a world that thinks everybody should be pretty perfect all the time. Because it just isn't true. And it's just not going to happen. And people are going to break. And, you know, that's the truth.
Don't you think, too, that I always think that the difficulty in America for a large part stems between rural and urban areas, because in the rural areas, you don't have diversity. You don't see anybody, or at least anybody you don't see anybody of color usually. You don't see if people are gay or transgender or whatever, you probably don't know it. And then it's only when you do know somebody and you say, oh, I love my Uncle Joe and I never realized he was gay. And if he's gay, it must be okay.
Right.
It's that you can't have that separation. While in New York City, everyone has something that's outsider.
It's not as weird in New York City. That's true. That's true. In Westchester, it's a no-no. You can't even mention it. You're just like, yeah. I mean, you can't.
Let's talk about sense of place, because, you know, you live right in Manhattan. I used to live in Manhattan. I live right outside the city, but I'm there all the time. When you're in a place like New York City, I always feel like, you know, they accept anything. You can be just anything there. It's so diverse. I mean, the first day I moved to New York City in the 80s, I saw this guy walking towards me with a big smile, and he had a tree branch strapped to his head. And I thought, this is the place for me, because people accept you.
Well, it's the only place where loony bin is okay.
And
loony bin is used a lot. Oh, I just got out of the loony bin. Or are just, you know, like the whole thing is because it's about characters.
Right.
New Yorkers like to think of themselves as characters, you know, and so, yes, I would say definitely, since in Westchester, where I grew up, Caroline, and in Israel, where there's war, you can't be crazy. You just can't.
Can you tell me, like, what it felt like for you when you were first writing about mental illness? Were you scared?
I was terrified. It's a frightening, overpowering, overwhelming feeling.
So tell us about the book in which you first wrote about mental illness and how it made you feel, and talk about the characters a little for us.
Well, I wrote this book about a girl who felt the darkness. Her father had committed suicide, and so she feels him calling her to him. And she calls it the darkness, and she can't tell anyone about it. Nobody. But she meets this mentor who's based on Grace Paley. And she realizes that this mothering figure offers her some kind of acceptance of that thing in her head, which is called the darkness. Now, when I say crazy, I do not mean not being able to talk or word salads or schizophrenia. I'm talking about depression is crazy. I don't really mean anything else other than that. It's a darkness, and that there's a kind of beauty to it, because in a way, in the hospital, I read more than I ever read in my life. I read a lot of Camus, which The Myth of Sisyphus, if you remember that famous philosophical book. Mm-hmm. And I think what incarceration, I was in for a year and a half, and I was outside all of society. And I can tell you, Caroline, with some honesty now, that getting out, people looked at me very suspiciously. And if anything happened, it was always my fault. And that's when I began to really rely on Grace. And
So
to
they
see
never
that
gave
the
you room.
stigma is just, the stigma is so powerful, and I did it happened that my Black friend, Mae Jackson, and I did a series together. We went into mental hospitals teaching about Black otherness and mental patient otherness. And it was the same feelings. They're human feelings of alienation, or that you don't fit in, or you just having scary thoughts, like maybe you shouldn't live. This is too horrible. You shouldn't live. And I think that a lot of it has to do with community. And one thing about writing is when you're writing your novel, you're not in community, but you're thinking of a community. So my novel is also about a love for this mother, which she understands will cure her of the darkness. I don't know if that explains it, but it's hard to explain.
You said that one of the things you said to me was that your parents and your friends thought you should originally write humor pieces.
Yes, my mother said, "Is it funny? You were really funny when you were a kid. Yeah, before you started to kill yourself, you were really funny." Yeah.
But you staked out your own.
Funny, trying to kill yourself. No, that was not amusing. We didn't like that.
So do you see the changing norms? So do you see the changing norms in gender contributing to a feeling of being an outsider to previous generation of women? I mean, I see there's
it would have been unheard of.
I want to say something. In the past month, I've seen, it's so interesting to me because I've seen 3 different novels which all dealt with women who did not want to be mothers and yet who were mothers.
Yeah, that's another
and I thought
stigma.
That's something that never would have been, that would have given you instant outsider status years ago. And now it seems like it's coming into, people can talk about it now. They're not ashamed to admit,
that was mental
illness. I should have had children, or I'm not happy with this. And a lot of these novels that I read are sort of, they're brutal. And there's one, The School for Good Mothers, which I actually love, but it's a really dark book about how if you're not a good mother, the society will take your child away from you. So we see that, being a woman has certainly changed things, even in literature. When I wrote my 1950s novel about the Jewish women, it was so horrifying to me because I had to write in details where Ava, this woman, was not allowed to have a checking account. Only a man could sign up for her. She was not allowed to buy a house because women weren't. Anyone who was divorced, oh my God, that meant all you wanted to do was sleep with all of the men in the neighborhood. So as the mores change, whoever becomes the outsider changes. So what do you think about all of that?
I think it's very true. And I think that you can say things now that you couldn't say like 10 years ago. I think divorce is a real stigma still. And there's been a lot of novels about divorced couples, about not getting along with your other. But I think suicide, you're going to see, is going to be very major. And after this pandemic and after this shut-in, you're going to hear mental illness. I already see advertisements on the television for psychiatry. And my husband is very busy. So, but it used to be 10 years ago, if you said that, it was like you were a leper. They used to call, if you read the history of the shaming of mental illness, there's a wonderful book by Foucault, the madness is history. They were actually, if you were in a mental hospital, you were put on crossroads and murdered if you had been crazy or if you had been suicidal or any of those things. And so I think we have to also give ourselves credit for coming a long way, but with a lot of ways to go.
But what about, I think it was in the 70s, was it, there was a book, it was either by this Dr. Thomas Saz, or maybe it was R.D. Laing.
Right, he was a big, that was a big change.
Mental illness was a prize because your brain saw and felt things
that were very deep
in a way so that you were actually, maybe you were an outsider, but you could learn more.
Well, I don't know if I had as much empathy before I got sick, but I know that I have empathy now. Like if I can feel someone else's pain very much like it's my own.
Okay.
And I know I only feel that way, and I only have that gift because empathy is a gift because of my own suffering. You know, and it was many years ago, but I'm still, I can't lie and say that I'm still, but announced to the world I was in a mental hospital, I wouldn't dare. You know, it's still, you know, oh, someone in the room is crazy. I don't like the word crazy.
The word crazy is not a great word, especially now that they're finding out so many things, you know, that it's just all your brain rewiring.
Right.
But I totally understand the stigma. I mean, when I was writing the book about my female in prison, I went to talk to a lot of women who had come out of prison. And the really interesting thing I found out is that, you know, there's a weird stereotype of women in prison, but a lot of the women I talked to said that they had these amazing friendships and amazing support.
It was inside a mental hospital, Carolyn.
Yeah, just like a mental hospital. It's not
like yourself.
I'm not saying that it was a great experience or that
but it was deep.
Scared and there was not violence, but some of them formed really intense, supportive friendships.
Right, and you can tell the truth.
I wanted to write about that and talk about that. I also want to talk about this whole notion of, you know, when you're an outsider, there's a lot to forgive with what people do to you as an outsider. So how do we forgive people for pushing us away? And how do we have our characters?
Still working on it.
Yeah.
Still working on it. That's all I can answer. You know, I actually have this friend. I don't want to say who she is, but she was my best friend. And she was the one that called the hospital after, and she went away. And I understand why she went away. It was too much for her. But just recently, I posted on Facebook that I finished a new book, or I was beginning a new book, and there she was. She hadn't gone away at all. She was just scared. I think that you have to demystify mental illness. I think one of the things that I learned from my Black friend is that you have to show people what Black is. You know, don't show them the stereotype of the guy with the, you know, from Harlem who comes in, you know, work on positive and relatively more truthful portrayals of what is stigmatized. And I think it's a task that I take up every day, and it's something we have to do. About asthma, I was going to ask you, you see, I also have asthma, but that also is a stigmatizing thing because it's illness.
It does.
When you're a kid and you're ill, people don't get it as kids. They really don't get the concept of illness. It's really something that scares them. And what scares people drives them away. That's what I've learned.
But don't you think it's interesting, though, that there's so many books about people who have, you know, well, not so many, but there's an amount of books about people who, and movies about people who have been in mental institutions or in prisons, and people are drawn to those.
Yeah, I know. That's so out.
Like they're able to integrate with that, but they can't integrate with a real.
But I remember Sarah Lawrence, way back in 1973, I carried a copy of The Bell Jar. And one of my writing teachers said, put that away. Put that away. No. Yeah.
I want to go back to this whole thing of empathy. Part of being an outsider is, for me, it's that word hidden. You want to hide away. You don't want to be traumatized. But a year ago, I actually got an email from a friend who had just tortured me in high school, just been absolutely mean. She mocked my hair. She made fun of my dress. She made fun of how I looked. And I was so surprised that she had written to me. And I thought, well, you know what? I'm not facing her, so it's a little safer. So what I did is I wrote to her and I said, did you realize that you really made my life so difficult when I was in high school? I was struggling so hard and you really made it terrible. And she wrote back to me and she said, I know, and I'm sorry. And what she was going through, here she was, this beautiful cheerleader with tons of boyfriends, and she was gay and she hadn't come out. And she couldn't tell anybody. And her parents were alcoholics. and she couldn't tell anybody. And
Yeah.
we ended up having this really lovely long conversation. And I said, oh my God, I wish I had known, because you and I, we could have been friends. And she said, yeah, we could have. And that's what I want to do in writing. I want to bridge that divide between me and
it feels so
another
good,
person.
doesn't it?
Now I
It
love
feels
that
so
girl.
good. Yeah, no more secrets. Yeah.
Torture. So when I write in my novel, I want my characters to have a hard time. I want them to, because when you have a hard time, then you have to sit down and figure out, well, what really matters to me. I mean, for Simon, my character in With or Without You, he was a really famous at one time rock musician. And I remember, Leora, you and I had a conversation about this, about what does fame mean? It's got to mean something deeper than just wanting everybody to love you. And together we decided that what it meant is it's a way of saying, I am, see me, understand me, so I won't feel like that outsider. So I want to ask you, Leora, do you ever celebrate, like, what are the good things about being an outsider for you? Like, how do you celebrate those?
The depth and the truth and beauty. You know, what I've been talking about all along, that I can see a Van Gogh painting and I can go, oh, I know that feeling of turbulence. I know that feeling of outsiderdom. How beautiful, how human, how encompassing. I like living in truth. I don't like the lie that it takes to be a secret. That's an interesting thing to say if you think about it. I don't like the lie that people live under. I don't want to live under lies. You know, and so that there's a liberation, and there's a kind of like, life is this meaningful. I mean, life is this full. Life is this complex. You know, life is this substantive. That I grew so much in the mental hospital. I mean, I just, you know, I learned of people that I would never have met, and I learned of, you know, like the deep feelings that they have, sometimes towards self-harm. You know, some of them were divorced, but it was honest and it was truthful. And I think what you get being an outsider is you get substance. Let's just call it substance. And I feel sorry sometimes for people I see who live a kind of deceptive lie about life. Life is challenging. It's challenging.
Right.
And it goes deep.
For me, just answer this whole question of being an outsider, actually, I try to celebrate it more and more. I think the first step, if you feel like an outsider, is to the struggle to just accept it. And then for me, the next thing is to write about it. I found that when I give what I fear to another character, it sort of offers up a wall of safety for me. It's like I write about the terror of being alone. I wrote about that in With or Without You, a long-term couple, and all of a sudden they're apart. I write about like what it means when you're not famous anymore, if you felt that was what was, you know, making you a valuable person. I feel like the more that we talk about it, the less of being an outsider is really being an outsider. If you claim it, then if someone comes and mocks you or has an attitude, it can't impact you because you've claimed it and it's okay with you. When you feel shame, I always say, bring it out into the light. Shame shrivels up in the light and you can feel at least a little bit more empowered. And that's what I want for my characters.
Yeah.
Leora, we have time for one more question. I want to ask you, in your novel that you're writing now.
That I just finished or that I'm writing now?
Oh, you finished? Oh, that's right. That's
yeah, it's coming to you.
So when you write about shame and being an outsider, do you feel better when you're done writing?
Yes.
You do?
Yes.
Okay.
I feel like someone opened the window, you know, and I feel like God don't hit. First I feel the shame. I'm ashamed of being ashamed. So it's like it's doubling down on it. It's like all of a sudden it's like, I can't write this. I mean, how can I admit that this happened? I feel ashamed of being ashamed. But again, and I'm sorry, but this is repetitious. It has led me towards great art. You know, it has led me to reading and opening up my mind to other writers.
Yeah, open your mind up to
Yeah.
outsiders.
I mean, I just heard a writer on the radio talk about how she wrote a book, not about divorce, but I forget what it was about. It was about a love affair between two women or something. And I thought,
Okay.
wow, I understand, you
We
know?
need
And
to,
so
we
it
need
makes me
to,
feel oddly connected. You
we
know,
need to
the
stop
irony of
now.
it, yeah, the irony of it is that you're really more connected. You know, a
Yes,
lot of people
that's
feel shame.
exactly right. You're really more connected.
You're
And
really more connected, and you're more about being human. You're more about being truthful. You're more, it's the truth. I come from Westchester, and there's not a lot of truth there. I can tell you. There was a lot of money there, but there wasn't a lot of truth.
I think on that note, we're going to thank everybody who came up to hear us. We hope you will read our books because we both write about outsiders. Leora Skolkin-Smith, and I'm Caroline Leavitt. You can buy our books.
Thank you very much for coming.
And support independent bookstores. And also be gentle with yourself and be gentle with other people. And thank you. Thank you so very much. And
thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.